I would like to welcome you all. My name is Pam King to our first psychological science informed spirituality and thriving webinar. Today, we have a very esteemed gathering of three colleagues who happen to all be in Southern California, but at two distinct schools. Fuller Theological Seminary is where the Thrive Center is, and my colleague Brad Strawn is there, and Doctors Helen Immordino-Yang and Rodrigo Riveros are at USC, Center of Candle. But before we get into the webinar, I just want to give a few logistics. Thank you so much for being here. We are extremely grateful. The Thrive Center may be more or less familiar to some of you. And I just wanted to give you by way of background, we are a unique translational research center that really looks at psychological science informed understandings of spirituality and how that informs human thriving that promotes a flourishing world. We're very into understanding a psychology of personal growth and development in thriving, but that which actually contributes to the greater good, not just about individual well-being, but about a flourishing world and planet. And we are convinced that spirituality is a very significant part of that. So as we begin, we're giving you a poll. We'd like to know who is in the room. If you can just take 1 second, we'll share with you the diverse persons that are joining us. While you're filling that out, I'll let you know also in the chat, Andrea Gonzalez, the business manager of Thrive, is offering 2 documents. One is a bio, just to give you a bit more information about the panelists. And then a second is a loosely defined term sheet to offer a little bit of background on the way we think about spiritual development, spiritual formation, transcendence, meaning making, and thriving. So you can see those there. So Andrea, when we have the results, we'll move on. Is that something that will pop up? Well, while we're waiting for those results, we'll get going. Again, so excited to have you here, and especially for those of you on a Friday. We appreciate, my goodness, there is quite an equal distribution. We have almost a quarter clinicians and therapists, more than a quarter of clergy, about 30%, educators or academics, 19% students, and 26, a quarter of you identifying professionally in different ways. Well, thank you so much for that diversity and those different perspectives here. Towards the end of our panel, we will open up for questions. And for those of you who submitted some before, we greatly appreciate that. I want to acknowledge that our audience here today is really quite a diverse spectrum. I anticipate that there are some who are really excited about some nuts and bolts and technical neuroscience perspectives, what the brain is doing or maybe not. And some of you are practitioners and really want to connect what is science about spirituality have to do with how I am caring for, leading, serving, forming, shaping people spiritually around me. Some of you are coming from specifically religious contexts that may be Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, or otherwise. Some of you are coming from ecumenical contexts, schools, nonprofits, and some of you are coming from very secular or explicitly secular contexts, like public schools, where you're interested in issues of spirituality, but not necessarily connected to a religious tradition. We are going to attempt to address all those aspects of spirituality today. So my first question for our panel is, and particularly targeted towards our 2 neuroscientists, is how does neuroscience today help us understand how we grasp the transcendent? And I'll just add for our audience, when I speak of transcendent, as noted in the definition sheet, I am thinking of a reality that is beyond our mundane everyday experience. That could refer to a sense of deity, to God, Allah. It could have to do with beyond earthly powers, or other more emergent properties or transcendent properties. So with that, Mary Helen, Rod, take it away.
I'll start, Rod, and then you can pick up all the pieces I drop, okay? Well, thank you, Pam, and thank you to Brad and Rod for joining me in this really interesting and important panel discussion. It's very very gratifying to be here. So to start with your question, I mean, I think what has really pushed me toward the neuroscience, because I started as a teacher in a public school context, and I went to graduate school in human development and psychology to study how young people's thinking and feeling and cultural, ways of being shape their learning and their development over time. But really quickly realized, that the biological level of explanation actually gives us a kind of framing for understanding the nature of the processes that we're dealing with when we think about transcendence. And one of, I think, the most exciting kind of directions that neuroscience has gone in just recent years, really, is in understanding how it is that human beings, right, probably more so than any other animal on the planet, human beings construct a kind of alternative reality together, a cultural space of knowing that we might call meaning making, that is transcendent in the sense that it's not directly located in the physical here and now, but is instead a kind of shared cultural knowledge base about what it all is for, what is good and right, what it means to flourish, what it means to be together in a space, in a world, and to support each other in that space, in that world, in a way that is that shows both awareness of each other, but also awareness of self. And so understanding how it is that we've made that leap, so to speak, from here and now, from what evolutionary biologists call indexicality, right? The kind of mind that my dog has, that is deeply emotional and social, but that is really tied to what's going to happen next, and what do I know tends to happen in these kinds of contexts, right? And I heard the word walk somewhere in that, and so I run to the door, right? Human children break out of that in typical development very, very young. And they start to think not just about like, we're going for a walk right now, but like, what does it mean? And when's the last time we did? And what is kind of the cultural space in which we construct those understandings together? And so that's where I think the neuroscience has really made some advances that are very interesting in the context of the discussion we're having today.
Awesome. Just because part of thriving is being very authentic and human, I realized that I had a very human moment and forgot to ask you each to introduce yourself. So I'm going to go back and offer Mary Helen with the context of offering like how we construct cultural meanings. Why don't you share a moment about your research and what you do, and I'll ask Brad to do that as well. Thank you.
Sure, happy to. I kind of slipped it in a little bit, Pam. I was covering for you. You didn't have to. I was like, I did human development and psychology and then neuroscience, and here I am. But, you can admit it. That's okay. You can be humble. We love you for it. So I'm just being silly. But I'm a professor at USC in LA. I'm a professor in education and in neuroscience and in psychology, and specifically in brain and cognitive science and developmental psychology areas. And I study the ways that, especially young people, everybody, but especially adolescents and young people, construct meaning, and the ways in which that meaning construction process is shaped by their experiences, shaped by their dispositions of mind, their propensities of mind, and the ways that they construct a kind of positionality for self in their intellectual engagements and cultural and social engagements with the world, and what this means for them as humans in cultural context, what it means for society, what it means for democracy, what it means for the ways in which we orchestrate educational opportunities for our young people to develop these dispositions of mind and heart, not only in social domains or in spiritual domains, but also in academic domains. And what does it mean to be a physicist, right, with these dispositions, or a scientist, or a literature, or an artist in way. And we look at the ways that young people's brains develop, and the ways that these dispositions of mind appear to actually be an organizing force that grows their brains literally, physically over time. We actually can predict the ways that young people are going to grow their brain over the next several years, and what that will mean statistically for how happy, how fulfilled, how coherent their identity is, how much they like themselves, how much purpose they have in their life by their own description in young adulthood. So it's a very powerful process that young people are engaging in when they engage with meaning making, and we're trying to understand the neurobiological and psychosocial ways in which that happens.
Thank you. Rod, why don't you take a moment to introduce yourself, and then Brad, and then we'll go back to the question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Fan, for the invitation, and thank you to the panelists for joining us here. And also thank you to everyone, to the great team that you have at the Thrive Center that helped us to organize this webinar. My name is Rodrigo Riveros. I'm from Chile. I'm a psychologist. I completed my PhD in Brain and Cognitive Sciences at USC in the Brain and Creativity Institute. My doctoral research focused on how adolescents build more purposeful visions for their adulthood. And you can think let's say a young painter that wants to kind of bring essential aspect of human nature in their works. And in that regard, I start getting interest on the idea of transcendence as a particularly useful notion to kind of go beyond what we experience. And in that regard, and also with the support of Dr. King, Dr. Immordino-Yang, I completed a double postdoc at the Thrive Center within the Fuller Seminary, and also at USC at the Center of Affective Neuroscience, Learning, Education, and Development, Canada.
Yeah, awesome. Hi, I'm Brad Strawn, professor of clinical psychology here at Fuller School of Psychology, Fuller Seminary. I'm a clinical psychologist. I am a lot of my work is at the intersection of theology and psychology, oftentimes in clinical kinds of settings. I'm also an ordained pastor, and I serve part-time in a local congregation. And what I'm really interested in is the application and implications of all this amazing neuroscientific work that our friends are doing here, as well as cognitive science, and to find ways to make that applicable to church settings.
Great, thank you. So before our introductions there, Mary Helen, you were beginning to talk about the process of meaning making. And Rod, could you unpack for us a bit more what goes on within a person and how that enables them? What are those dispositions of mind that Mary Helen was talking about that enable us to grasp and experience transcendence?
That's a fantastic question. I think that one of the kind of main mechanisms, psychological mechanisms, certainly not the only one, but one important one will be our ability to some sort of construe and understand our experiences in more abstract terms, going beyond what happens in the here and now, and start thinking on some sort of moving our minds, our hearts more to what's beyond that, what it means and what the moral implications of our daily happenings are. So in that regard, for instance, that's why we have centered on meaning making as a personal, subjective, relational, and dynamic way of understanding our experiences, but in a way that can help us to build values. And these values not also inform our goals, our intentions, but I think that they also help us to navigate cultural values, to navigate ideologies, to navigate and imagine a better society. So that process, although it might be general, in spirituality, find the fertile ground, that phrase that I like so much that you use, a fertile ground in which these predispositions can actually grow further.
Mm-hmm. Can someone elaborate when you said moving our hearts and our minds towards that which is beyond us? Can you unpack what you mean by distinguishing between mind and heart? And how do we understand that scientifically?
Fantastic. Yes. So it's well, of course, it's a figure of speech, but what we're trying to show here, it is that, first of all, it is very hard, if not impossible or misleading, to kind of dissociate in our thinking emotions and cognitions. Mm-hmm. So all these spiritual ideas, as cognitive, as rational that may sound to us, they are embedded and they actually are powered by emotion that come from our guts and expresses in our body in ways that we found to be culturally relevant and culturally meaningful. So in that regard, being a spiritual person, it's not only a predisposition of thinking in some ways, but also in feeling and being sensitive and being able to express our ideas in particular ways.
Can you address anyone, I'm opening this up, to how those, the thinking and the thoughts about, I'm going to just apply it to transcendence, about what is transcendence, who is transcendence? If I'm thinking of God, is God loving, is God kind? If I'm thinking polytheistically, if there's many gods, or just that there is this sense of unity of being, lots of different ways of conceiving of transcendence. How are the thoughts, the content of the thoughts, how do they interact with those feelings and emotions? I've heard you use the term resonance before. What does resonance mean from your perspective?
Okay, I'll start. I'd like to hear what Brad would have to say about it, and then I could respond to that too. But I'll start a little bit about resonance, because you dropped that, something that I've called empathic resonance, I think. Maybe other people have called it that too, I have no idea. But the idea is that transcendence in this kind of frame that we're working from is both a mind state and a brain state. It's a set of dynamic processes that we engage that allow us to construct a sort of subjective sense that something matters. And it's in that way kind of a set of ideas or a narrative that's imbued with emotional power and meaning, that is culturally situated, that becomes a kind of story for why. It becomes the undergirding of the ways in which we construct decisions and cognitions and actions in the moment, and it's also transcendent in the sense that it becomes something that, with practice and with maturity and with emotional health, becomes stable over time. Not in the sense of being stagnant, but in the sense of being sort of readily able to be called up or conjured by the person. It's something that you actively construct. I take that from cognitive psychology, right, and neo-Piagetian kinds of things. Like, it's something that you actively construct that is a way of understanding and positioning yourself and your ideas in the world in order to kind of connect here and now with broader values and beliefs, with historical contexts, with future possible spaces. Being able to move through that space of culturally constructed ideas, and the sort of neurological processes that support that make that possible, the embodied kind of sequelae that imbue it with a subjective sense of emotional meaningfulness or relevance to yourself, like Rod suggested, and then also the cultural piece that sort of is shared across with people around you, and that becomes the basis for making shared decisions together about the way in which we construct our communities and our lives and our behaviors in that space.
That's fascinating. Brad, I'd love to ask you, based on what Mary Helen just beautifully described about these intricate processes that the human mind / brain go through in terms of figuring out what is, in really layperson's language, emotionally relevant or emotionally meaningful to us, that become salient, that become valent, that have a valence that actually gets internalized into our sense of identity or potentially shared identity in a group, to the extent that it informs how we act. How in faith-based settings might you see these senses of, how do beliefs become meaningful? How does a sermon go from a bunch of good ideas or things we should do to being a place that it becomes meaningful and actually internalized?
Well, I think I might answer that kind of just grabbing a few things that Mary Helen and Rod have said. I love how you can sense they're neuroscientists, but they care about whole embodied persons. I hope that comes through to everyone who's listening. That we are biological beings, we are cultural beings, And for many of us who are religious, we also will hold to something beyond that. And so when I think about, your question a minute ago, Pam, about, how does something become meaningful in a transcendent way? I think all those things are operative at the same time. The more they're in resonance with one another, to borrow that phrase, I think the more meaningful it becomes to the person, and the more then it may translate into actual behavior, virtue, character, behavior, all those kinds of things that many of us are quite interested in. I'm very interested in cognitive psychology, in the sense of that I think with many people, that we think with our bodies, that we think with other bodies, that we actually think with things outside of our bodies. And so we can think about even a religious community or a culture. There's a way in which we extend our thinking into those around us, and vice versa. And so for me, spirituality becomes really supersized, which is a phrase I like to use. Supersize your spirituality by being embedded within a community of other like-minded people. Doesn't mean you all think exactly alike. In fact, I hope there's some variability there, because we all know that spirituality and religion can become quite problematic if it becomes too insular. But to have a community of faith, and I'm not just talking about church, but I'm also talking about church, that can be something that really, I think, extends and expands and enhances all the kinds of good stuff we're talking about, whether it's meaning making, religious moral behavior, or whether it's even a felt sense of the transcendence. I think that happens more powerfully. People will report that, right, when they're in groups oftentimes than when they're by themselves. I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, Pam, but it's the question I wanted to answer.
Thank you. No, that was great. I was hoping you'd say something about relationships, which goes back so much to Rod and Mary Helen's research on relationships, that these dispositions or minds, or this capacity to develop empathetic meaningfulness, doesn't happen alone or in isolation. And your guys' research has really showed the significant socio-affective element of meaning making that might allow us to have transcendence. Would you guys elaborate on the role of relationships in that, and what you've learned?
I would love to give it the first step. I like so much what Brad just said about the importance of relationships. So I think that, and also it seems that a lot of the audience is interested on meaning making. So I would say that kind of building, or from a sermon in any Sunday afternoon at church, and taking that, make it your own, and kind of translate it into action that are congruent with your ideas, requires what we simply call just time to reflect. It's the time, it's the space, but it is also the community. You cannot, it's very hard to do it alone. You need props sometimes you need ritual, you need ceremonies, but overall, and more importantly so, I think you need a community of people in which you can practice your beliefs, you can practice thinking deeply, in which you can listen and help edit others, and also a community that can hear you out and can listen to you and can help you to think in maybe I don't want to say healthier, but maybe in more abstract ways about your experiences. And it's the same process that you can see in a church community, that you can see in psychotherapy, that you can see in schools. It's a community in which you can practice your thinking, and with the help of others. And I think that it's not only others as people that can just give you more information, but it's on that relationship that these ideas get their strength, get their psychological power. It's because I'm talking with someone that matters to me, and what the person is saying, it's also so important to me that kind of gives the power to change my behavior, to try to accommodate or assimilate new events of my life, just in the case of trauma. And that conversation, that put it into words, that help you think about what's important for you in any happening in any life event. I think that's part of the process by which people can start thinking in more abstract ways.
Brad, I'd love to hear your perspectives on relationships, just to expand from specifically their neuroscience research, but just even from an attachment perspective, how you have seen, relationships and being connected with people helpful for grasping and understanding spirituality.
Yeah, I love the two of yours work on reflection. In practical theology, we actually have here at Fuller, we talk about practice, reflection, practice. That is the way to learn, to grow, to live into a life of faith and spirituality. You know, as I've been reading your research, I don't think I read the phrase secure attachment, but there's so much of that is implied in that we know that even securely attached children, right, grow up to be more open adults. And so, Rod, you were just kind of, you know, inferring that in some ways. If we have communities of attachment, whether that's the church or whether that's a classroom setting, whether that certainly in the psychotherapeutic setting where I spend a lot of my time, there begins to develop this ability to reflect, actually, right? To think about things in new ways because you're safe enough to do that. And I think this is so vital right now, Pam, because we live in a very bifurcated, polarized culture in the United States, and people are doubling down on their religiosity in certain kinds of ways, right? And religion's now become a weapon for many groups rather than an open conversation or a kind of what some of us would say, loving one's neighbor as oneself. And I think part of the problem there is we may not have the kinds of relationships we need where we can pause and think, right? And sort of all the, our limbic system, our amygdalas can all sort of settle down and we can start to think again. Obviously thinking and feeling not separated there, but those are some things that come to mind. How can we create communities where there's earned attachment? You know, where there's maybe a bunch of people that have had, or a third maybe, or something like that, who have insecure attachments. Are there ways in which we can create communities of faith or communities in the classroom or whatever it is, where there can be a sense of safety to allow that reflection, to allow new ideas to come to the fore, to create a sense of openness that I think leads to a more democratic community, a less authoritarian community, that leads to, as I've already said, openness and real dialogue with one another.
So timely and important. Mary Helen, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's such a great jumping off point for also bringing back these ideas to the science again. And this isn't just our science, this is like a whole field of science, you know, kind of condensed. And one of the things that we've really realized, we, the scientific community, over the past, you know, 10 years or so, especially, we've known it for a while, but it's really, really becoming very, very clear now, is the very real biological interdependence of humans on one another, on one another's presence, on one another's opportunities for cultural learning, to literally teach your brain and body how to grow themselves. And so, you know, we see, and these things have been described now for decades, you know, relationships between children's attachments, right? How safe they feel with a primary caregiver that they can always rely on, that they can always seek comfort from, that they can always trust will be there when they need them and will be a safe adult for them. That these kinds of attachments have even biological power. It's like a young child's biology and genetics is waiting for some information about what kind of world did I land myself in, what kind of social world did I land myself in, and so how should I grow myself in order to adapt myself well to flourish as best I can in that space, whatever that world is. And secure attachment seems to provide a way, ironically, right, but it makes good sense in the context of what Brad was just saying, ironically, a way for biological growth and development to slow down, right? So people who are in secure attachments, young children in secure attachments, tend to show, later puberty, for example, onset, and slower brain development across adolescence than children who are in insecure attachments when they're young. Just on average, like you can't say any particular person had something happen and so their brain's different or something. But like we know that abuse in toddlers and insecure attachment in toddlers is associated with early onset of puberty, things like that. Why? Because it's almost as if the biology says, wow, I'm in a dangerous place. You can't really trust what's going to happen here. I got to look out for myself. Like you got to mature quick and be tough and be able to be a full adult as fast as you can. So you're not reliant on these people around you who aren't trustworthy for you, right? So the point here is that this is biologically true. It's also culturally and mentally true, that the ways in which we come to make meaning and we build stories and we construct a sense of self in secure ways that we've been talking about for the last several minutes are literally built out of the co-constructed safe spaces in which we are biologically bonded to each other in different ways depending on the kind of relationship you have. Adults to children is one kind, or adults to each other, or committed adults in a romantic relationship is yet another, right? So there's many different cultural frames in which we construct these safe relationships, and they have different kinds of affordances. But what is really clear biologically now is that the co-regulation of our physiological stress responses and hormonal fluctuations and things like that are really fundamental to constructing biological and psychosocial and emotional and mental health.
Super profound. I want to ask, a few questions have come up through the chat and the question and answer just while we're on this topic. Just to super oversimplify, things that I'm hearing that are so extraordinary to me is here we are talking about transcendence. How do we grasp God, realities beyond the mundane? And where our conversation has gone is to the fact that we have bodies, that we have brains, that we have minds that take shape in interpersonal human everyday life circumstances, and how absolutely fundamental this being humanness on the earth, feeling safety, primitive needs is to our grasping that which is beyond us, transcendence. And so some great questions have really come up that we are dealing with bodies and brains and relationships. What happens to people who experience trauma, where they might end up with some impairments because of trauma that might impact some of these embodied functions and our embeddedness, our ability to relate with each other? A question has come up around, how does trauma impact this meaning-making process? And also, I'll ask separately, but just to plan in your mind, also, how does depression get in the way of being able to experience transcendence or God or relationships, etc.? So who would like to?
How about I start? Brad and Rod, you tell me if this is okay. I start with a little bit of the biological of what's going on there and how it translates into psychological dispositions and sort of readinesses, so to speak. And then you guys can pick up with different levels of how this may shape the way we form values and the way we heal, okay? The pieces that you know best. So the first thing I would say, Pam, is I wouldn't think of trauma as leading to impairment, right? I think of trauma as leading to adaptation, right? And I don't mean to correct you, except that, like, I think it matters, right? And in a sense, there is impairment, right? When you think about you need to be able to achieve a certain kind of skill level in a particular domain, and you can't, then you are impaired in that sense. So it's not incorrect to say. But what if we were to also reframe it as adaptation and understand that all of the downstream consequences and developmental consequences of trauma are not, except in the case of like a broken arm or something where you're physically injured, they come from you mentally trying to accommodate yourself to flourish in the space of that style of relating. And so they're very actively constructed by the person, and they serve a purpose, right? And when we understand it that way, it becomes much more, I think it becomes more intuitive as to how you might help a person grow out of that or through that into being able to adapt themselves into a different kind of context. where they can thrive and flourish more broadly than just in one relationship that produced trauma for them, right? And so what happens in the brain when you experience trauma? Basically, trauma is an attempt by the person to understand what's happening when what is happening feels extremely overpowering and out of control, and you can't understand it, right? You can't make predictions, and you can't sort of have any kind of intuitive narrative about why or what's really going on. And if you think of that as a very, very basic kind of disposition, right? Not disposition, a very basic kind of definition of what leads to traumatic experience, then you can appreciate that what the brain does and the person does, right? Those are kind of two ways to say it. You can measure it by looking in their brain, or you can measure it by talking to them. But what they do is learn how to be very vigilant and how to adjust their behavior to watch for the cues that certain kinds of sequences of actions and relationships and happenings might be likely to play out, and then ready yourself for that. Mm-hmm. So what does that do? That really does a couple things. First of all, it predisposes you toward anxiousness, right, and anxiety, because anxiousness is in effect a hyperactivity of the circuits that allow you to watch the world, right? And like, what's going on? Well, my heart's pounding, and you're just like, you're out here and you're watching. And then the flip side of that is that, you can kind of think of these networks in the brain as sort of balancing the network connectivity. Now, there's no physical picture of this in the brain, but the ways that these systems kind of balance with each other, it's almost like a seesaw, where you have kind of attention into the outside world, and that's extremely necessary to be able to manage yourself in the world and to be empathic and to notice the people around you and all that kind of stuff, and to behave and get things done. But then there's also this pivot back into the other direction where you can kind of step back and do what we called in a 2012 paper constructive internal reflection, right? Where you construct some kind of understanding that's dissociated from the immediate context. And so you can't do that effectively when you're in danger. But then the downside is when you get out of that immediate danger, what tends to happen in people who've experienced emotional trauma is that you then get here and you get stuck because you have no natural sort of ability or skill for moving yourself back and forth, and you ruminate and you get depression and you get things that lead to other kinds of issues and mental health problems. So what you really want in a person is the dynamic ability to appropriately move themselves into these different states of mind in accordance with the needs of the current situation. Like, there are times to stop and reflect, and the middle of the soccer game when you're the goalie is not it, right? But at the same time, if you're always out doing these things, then you start to feel empty. Like, there is nothing to think about when you get in this inside of yourself kind of narrowizing space. And so the trauma teaches you to kind of watch at the expense of building a kind of regulated pattern for engaging with the world and then stepping back and making bigger meaning of that. And then the last little piece is that, the pivot of the seesaw or the teeter-totter is systems that are involved in what you might call salience detection, affect. Does this matter? Am I aroused? Do I need to attend? How important is this? How deeply does it sort of, sit with me? And those systems are the same ones that are also controlling and reading back guts and viscera and whether your heart's pounding and how your lunch is being digested and all that. So you're tying your embodied experience of noticing and salience and what matters and what you need to look out for to the ability to kind of shift yourself from like engaging with the world in a goal-directed way, in an empathic way, or alternatively shifting into a mode of brain and mind where you're inclined to sort of let down your guard, not be vigilant, engage with the deeper meaning making with others or alone, and kind of construct those bigger stories about values and beliefs and how the world works and how it should work.
Thank you. Rod, love you to elaborate as you might see fit.
Did you mind if I go next? I think I can say a few things that can help us also to bridge with what Brad was just saying about the idea of attachment. So I think that in our research, what we have learned is that in this warm and secure relationship with others, is that we can become, our body can be just help us to listen to our own thoughts, to our own ideas. And in the context of trauma and depression, what we have observed there, like it's about the power of conversations within these secure relationships. It's we have seen it in particular using intergenerational storytelling, basically having adolescents and older adults talking and sharing their life stories. And when you have that, when you are an adolescent and you see an older adult talking about a traumatic life event and how they overcame it, how they came to terms to anything that can be so meaningless and so harmful, that gives the adolescent some sort of a new lens to kind of look and review their own life in a way that it becomes more constructive, it becomes more abstract, it becomes more like enriching their identity and their purposes. We have seen, this is talking with adolescents from our communities in LA, is that for instance, their goals, and I use life goals as some sort of a vehicle for values, for expressing values. Their goals itself, they don't change, but what they change is their understanding of their own goals. It's not a goal. So this is one example. I can recall one participant saying that that person, he was avoiding social drama. So he was avoiding fight with friends, with romantic partners. So that person was avoiding all of that. He didn't want that. He wanted to focus on school, which is basically a very frequent goal for youth. And after this conversation, we see like a shift on the goal. And now the goal is to try to understand others better and yourself better in a way that you can help them. And that being the means by which you have less conflict in your life. So through this conversation, through rehearsing your own narrative, your own life and the way you're gonna see it, you're basically changing the way that you embody your own values and you live like in congruent ways with it. And I think that that's only possible when you are first on a secure, on a warm relationship. I mean, I don't mean to be prescriptive, but this is kind of the perfect condition for doing so. Because also, as Mary Helen pointed out, this sort of relationship help us to calm our bodies down, to focus on what's in here and how that can help us to inform what we do out there.
That's great. You both sound like clinical psychologists to me. That's amazing. I'll try to be brief, Pam, because of the time, but I do think, like with Mary Ellen, that it's that when we have experiences in life, we're always meaning-making creatures. I love phenomenology and existentialism, those branches of philosophy, and I would describe it as what people do is they create organizing principles, which are basically, I would describe those as embodied relational configurations of self and other in the world. Some of those are conscious and some of them are unconscious or outside of conscious awareness, but they're influencing us. We have lots of good evidence that they're influencing us in really powerful ways. The problem is, again, while they were adaptive at one point, they get misused in present situations where they don't necessarily need to be used, right? So they're not actually in danger, but they believe they're in danger. And so they respond from that place and it causes all sorts of problems. It's kind of a misinterpretation. It's a mismeaning, if you will, right, of a present context or situation. Furthermore, people who've had trauma often are unable to articulate a cohesive story. Their narratives get chaotic and disjunctive and all sorts of things, which again is why it's so important for the reflection that both Rod and Mary Helen are talking about. What I'm interested in is how this then gets played out in experience with the transcendent. Now God or the divine or Allah or whoever it might be is someone that I can't trust, or it's someone that I need to be leery of, or someone who's waiting for me to make a mistake. Sometimes this is taught through the cultural context of religiosity, But sometimes, again, it's a kind of misinterpretation of what's being taught based on someone's organizing principles from the past. And therefore, what is needed is new experiences, new relational experiences with both others and with the transcendent. And you were talking about the sort of the vertical transcendent, and then there's the immanental horizontal experience of God through other people. I think both of those are important and both of those are valuable. And we psychologists, sometimes we get a little stuck in the horizontal aspect of that. But I do want to acknowledge that there is also this sense of, again, if you hold to a transcendent power, that power can probably do whatever it is it's able to do. And we know people who've had, for example, really bad attachments, really chaotic and traumatic childhoods, who actually have positive attachment with their God concept. So that's pretty amazing as well.
Super amazing. Thank you for this rich conversation. I'm going to transition a little bit. So we were just talking about all these capacities that are required for the co-construction of understanding transcendence, experiencing God, experiencing something beyond the self, and the potential power, when that goes right, of helping us reconstruct meanings, abilities to emotionally regulate, not get stuck, create more cohesive narratives. A really profound question came up, asked about why camping experiences, particularly faith-based camping experiences, may be so powerful and influential for young people in understanding their identity and their spirituality, committing to pro-social norms. And I just want to expand that a little bit in thinking about what are optimal contexts. We talked about trauma getting potentially in the way. What are optimal contexts? And then why might something in the great outdoors with peers, with caring adults, connecting you to God, why might that be helpful? Anyone?
I'll go. How about if I go first, then you guys can correct me or add something else. I think everything we've been describing sort of answers that question in a lot of ways, right? The other research piece we might put is that, we know being in greenery does things to the hormonal and neuronal system, and it can boost your, I think, serotonin levels and stuff like that. So there's something actually about being in green spaces, which is really powerful, especially against depression. But again, it's that deeply relational experience, right? Being together. There's an intensity to it, which I also think embodied and extended cognition speak to. There's an intensity. There's a kind of openness that takes place in some of these settings, right? Where adolescents or even adults begin to share things they don't normally share. So I think that's some of the reasons that some of that's going on. I do want to say one caveat, though, is that many of us who spent time doing church camp up in the mountains remember coming back on Monday. And that when we went to school on Monday, suddenly it felt like everything we had experienced was gone. And I think that just, I don't know that it's gone. I don't want to say it's actually gone. But I do want to say, I think it speaks to the necessity of ongoing relationships, of ongoing reflection, of ongoing experiences, right? That there's, and then I think this is where sometimes, at least in religious communities and religious education, we've put a lot of emphasis on a moment in time. Rather than a process of formation. And I think that's something that Rod and Mary Helen, your work even picks up, I think, in secular educational settings, right? That you can't do like a one and done, or you can't just like focus on the teacher. It's got to be this ongoingness. So I'll stop there.
If I can segue, Brad, on this, to add to what Brad just said, I think that a bit of the power of these experiences comes from youth. I think that youth, it's a particular period, they yearn these experiences. They crave spaces in which they can think and have these type of conversations. So in that regard, developmentally, they are so sensitive to this sort of conversation and how they can enrich their own identity, that it makes it kind of the, as a youth program note at this point, that kind of the right ground just to grow. So that one part. And the other, and just completely spot on, Broad, about, I think that most researchers doing this type of research will advocate about building spaces in which youth can systematically reflect. And just making sure that the culture of the institution also supports that, and support that because this operation, beyond spirituality, it seems to be so positive and healthy for their own development.
So to build off of both of those, like I think it also really speaks to the need for us to innovate in the way that we organize and design school experiences for kids. Even our public schools, right? We need to start to build around the notion that young people need safe, caring, loving relationships around them that are appropriate for them. They need spaces to expand their own sense of self and to try on different identities and ways of engaging with information. I'm sorry for the screaming in the background. The little kids in the schoolyard behind me are all on at recess up there running around. I didn't know they were going to be out at just this time. Usually it's earlier. Anyway, but we really need to seriously rethink, I think, the ways that many of our most dearly held structural and assessment-oriented ways of doing schooling are just developmentally even harmful to kids. Not just not supportive to kids, but they're harmful to kids. I mean, why do kids only can know things if they work alone, for example? Right? You can't ask your neighbor for help, and yet we want our kids to be connected with each other, right? Why are you looking at his paper? Well, obviously because he knows better than me, and I want to know what he thinks, so let me ask him, right? And many times kids from other cultural backgrounds, like indigenous kids who immigrate to the U.S., they have to unlearn these natural propensities to learn together in these communally oriented ways where they co-construct things together and they try to help each other's understanding. And those things are not just not supported, they're actively punished in our schools. They don't count as learning or achievement. And I think that this is a major problem. It's really developmentally incompatible with what kids and adolescents need.
I appreciate you saying that, Mary Helen. One of our aims at the Thrive Center is how does our understanding of human thriving, the role of spirituality in that, how do different people groups naturally do that? So here you're saying people from some different indigenous cultures naturally do the interrelatedness, and then they come here and get unlearned out of it. But how can we turn to other Black communities, brown communities, mixed communities? What are the natural resources around safe connections, around spaces for reflection, around spaces for unfolding and experimentation? Some of us do innovation better than others, and some do connecting, but really to empower different, whether it's spiritual traditions, et cetera, to identify the resources, the practices, and the rituals within their traditions and communities that are already there, and to augment them and further adapt them for this kind of growth and health. On that note, I'm going to synthesize a few questions that have come in that are asking about spiritual practices. So essentially one question is, how does what you are all talking about from a neuroscience perspective inform how we might approach some more traditional spiritual practices? So this could be a great mixed conversation of Brad, our chief professor of spiritual formation, and then also a question about not just individual spiritual practices, but what happens when they're shared spiritual practices, whether worship or more contemplative shared experiences. And then the third, you can take which part you want, is how might spiritual practices offer, quote unquote, an added benefit than just clinical interventions? Is there something about invoking a sense of transcendence from a cognitive or affective perspective, offer more than just a technical clinical intervention? So I'll throw those three out there and let you guys have at them in our last few minutes. Sorry, maybe next time I won't do 3 questions in one.
Okay, I'll jump in real quick. There's a whole lot of stuff going on, I think, with spiritual practices. There is what they do at the sort of the biological, affect regulational, I think we can see a lot of ways in which things like mindfulness, of course, have their roots within religious traditions, both in Asian religions, but also in Christianity and Western religions as well. And that we know that while they ostensibly are for the opportunity to connect with the divine, they're not magic, right? They're really understood as a way in which to posture yourself so that one might have an encounter with the divine. They're also doing things to us physiologically. And there's been, some research that has demonstrated what some of that does. I don't think that negates one or the other. I think it's fantastic that they both work together. We need to downregulate in a lot of ways, I think, to be able to listen. St. John of the Cross said God's first language is silence. So how can we get silent enough to perhaps hear the divine, the transcendent? I tend to stay away from the language of private practices, for example. I might say you might engage in a personal practice, but the way I think about human beings and Christian community is it's never personal. You're always engaging in practices for the good of the world, really. If Thomas Merton said, if your spiritual practices don't lead you out to the fruits of the Spirit in the world, then you're doing them wrong. Which I think sometimes gets forgotten and missed. I do think there's something powerful, though, when a bunch of bodies are in the room doing something together. There's that sort of limbic resonance. I was looking at a study the other day that says when two people are imitating each other, there's some evidence their EEGs start to light up at the same way. And you guys probably know more about that in the fMRI moment. So there is something that really happens there. I think, again, we're wired to imitate one another. With mirror neurons and the like. So practices together, I think, are really powerful and meaningful. So I think spiritual practices are amazing because they're whole embodied, embedded things. And so I think it's sad in some ways that religious education and religious practices have gotten, at least in certain circles, aimed a lot at sort of the intellect rather than the whole embodied person.
I think that when you, I think one of the questions was comparing clinical settings with spiritual practices. I think that at least the research we have encountered so far shows mostly general mechanisms. So I think that one adolescent walking at night sees a full moon and think, wow, we are really small in the universe. There's something bigger than us. And that person listening to a sermon and kind of making sense of it, these are the same processes. To me, what's particular about religion and spiritual formation, it's the explicit focus on thinking and dedicating your efforts on reflecting about transcendence. And I think that that makes it not only unique, but it's one space in which youth can also use it as a space for practice.
Thanks, Ron. Anything else you want to add, Mary Helen?
I mean, I think it's already been said well, just to kind of bring it all the way home again. I mean, one of the things that our research has shown, again, is that when young people engage in these, we haven't studied this in spiritual domains, but when they engage in transcendent thinking sort of spontaneously about complex social issues, they become deeply emotionally engaged in it. And the degree to which they do that, activates certain systems in their brain dynamically, but it also allows us to predict their brain development over the next 2 years above and beyond IQ, socioeconomic status, parents' education level, right? So there's something about a kid sort of pushing themselves, disposed to push themselves beyond what they could sort of automatically think like or talk like, to really try to understand, like, why? What's the bigger meaning? What's the lesson for me and for my own character and my own virtues and for how the world works or could work? And when kids are disposed to engage that way, it literally grows them over time. And we see this across different ways of measuring the brain's structural growth. And again, we're comparing kids to themselves 2 years before, not kids to each other. So it's not about what kind of brain they have. It's about how much they are going to grow themselves over the subsequent 2 years and then the subsequent 3 years after that. So it's really powerful. We are biological beings with spiritual, transcendent capacities. And so all of these levels of understanding and analysis are dynamically interconnected and all afford us some insight into the nature of what it means to be a human in the universe, right?
Super powerful. What a great comment to end on. I just want to summarize by saying, just as a person, so many things that I'm taking away, whether from my classroom, my dinner table, the congregation I'm a part of, or my friendship groups, of how can I be an agent that engages with people in a really safe way, where they feel known, loved, where they're mirrored, to be engaged in relationships that are accountable and intimate, not just online relationships where we can share our guts, but where there's real being known and knowing, that reciprocity, a word I love to use, and to allow safe spaces for people to reflect, to pursue places where I can reflect. In our rapidly changing, those of us who are overly educated, we are still adapting our ideas and conceptions about the transcendent, about justice, about fairness. And I am just very encouraged by what you say. Each of you have contributed, and the hope that that actually brings for the changing and adapting growth of human thriving that really can contribute to more whole, more just and flourishing societies. So thank you each for your brilliant and extraordinary work, whether in labs, in clinical sessions, in papers, chapters, running societies, all the very different work the three of you do. I am super inspired, and I have seen so many positive quotes come up through chat of just people expressing their gratitude. So thank you for joining us for this hour. Happy Friday, wherever you are, or Saturday, for some of you in Singapore and New Zealand. Great to have you all with us. Thanks so much. We will be sending a little quick survey that would mean tons if you all who are participating wouldn't mind filling out. This is our first webinar like this. We'd love to know what worked and what didn't work. And please check out www.thethrivecenter.org. And please check out Mary Helen Center Candle at USC for extraordinary resources and information. Thank you all. Thanks for being with us.